Okay, we are on now.
Yeah, I wanted to talk between the three of us about the idea that the risk and safety world has moved from not just counting hazards and trying to correct hazards and controls, but the risk and safety industry's now moved into areas in which it's not familiar, and by its movement into a range of different areas, it's more than just doing what it used to do. It's now actually harming people by the very efforts it's making. And that has to do with movements now into psychosocial risk. It has to do with movements into area in which no one in risk and safety is trained at all. There's no expertise, there's no curriculum, there's no background or experience of where risk and safety is now moving, particularly in things like what we're calling now psychosocial safety or psychosocial hazards. And I find that no one seems to be talking about it, that somehow we can blithely go down this pathway and not, like, if you were speak to a doctor or a nurse, they have a fundamental mantra in their career of do no harm. That's kind of what the what's it called, the mantra of the doctor, do no harm, is that some sort of code. But it strikes me that the risk and safety industry has now moved into areas where, despite all its best intentions, it's actually doing more harm than good. And I think that would be worth talking about.
Sure. I think it's a good discussion. What do you think, Greg? What's your view?
Look, it's an interesting one from a legal risk management perspective. I was just looking up something. So there's kind of been a progression I look at it from a West Australian perspective, but there's been a progression. So we had an inquiry into high suicide rates in the fly-in, fly-out mining industry back in about 2015. And at that time, the regulator acknowledged that mental health was part of their remit under the health and safety legislation as it was then. They just never really acted on it. There had been quite an infamous health and safety prosecution in Victoria arising out of workplace bullying when a young waitress suicided after bullying in the workplace, and that involved a company owners and 3 workers all being prosecuted under health and safety legislation. Then we had the Enough is Enough report in Western Australia at about the same time all of the issues were coming out of Canberra with sexual misconduct in that environment. Then we had the Respect at Work report put out by the Australian Human Rights Commission, which created different some different frameworks again. And then we had pretty quickly all of the, I think it's all now, all except I think Victoria now, have adopted psychosocial regulations, and to be fair, they don't really say anything. There's just a structural. They don't say much at all. I think we spoke about this a couple of years ago. I think, and or it might be 12 months, a bit longer, and nothing, in my view, has really shifted from that position. I think health and safety has been forced down this path. I think there are a lot of people who work in health and safety who are very uncomfortable with now finding this on their plate, because it's not really what they trained for or understand their role to be. And yes, I think it is problematic. The main problematic thing I am seeing at the moment is the whole tick and flick mentality that I think is problematic in safety for physical risk is now being applied in the area of psychosocial risk.
Yeah.
And regulators, organisations are grappling with the relationship with regulators in terms of what do I disclose, what don't I disclose, because there's no mechanic. The legislation doesn't create any kind of mechanic or middle ground or process whereby you can have anonymous reports, if you like, and have a bit of flexibility in the way that they're approached. It all seems to fall into the same bucket. And I think people are trying, and there's lots of new buzzwords around this, so if I get them wrong, don't hold it against me, but when they talk about trauma-informed and victim-centric type approaches, I think a lot of people are using that language and they're trying to find ways to do this properly, but I think I just think it's a real struggle at the moment because we don't have, as you point out, Rob, I don't think health and safety as it's never had it as part of its curriculum.
No,
it's not part of its ethos, and everyone's kind of playing catch up, and we're seeing lots of third-party commercial products being dropped into this space very quickly.
yes.
I think it's problematic.
Well, and I've seen no change at all in the curriculum in risk and safety over the last 10 years. There's been no change. And so it's a bit like, well, I'm not sure it could even catch up, to be honest. But even things like trauma, I was writing to someone today about the way risk and safety approaches a typical incident investigation. And I said to this person, you've been asked by your CEO to go to this accident and interview people. And I would argue that you're interviewing people who are in trauma or who are distressed or who are in a process of grieving or grief in some form of loss. And I said to this person, have you any training at all in grief and loss counselling? And they said to me, what do you mean? And I said to them, I would not for 1 second go into a situation where a person was distressed or in trauma without very, very significant education and learning I've had in pastoral care. I wouldn't even entertain the probability, let alone walk into someone who was traumatized and ask them what happened in an accident.
Yeah.
As if they'd just witnessed someone had their leg chopped off or whatever it is, doesn't matter. But you're asked to go into that situation, and my argument would be if you do and you accept that task, you actually do more damage and more harm than good.
I think the regulator finds itself in a similar position. Rob, I'm not sure how much
Absolutely
of that sort of pastoral care the regulator brings to the conversation either. But again, that's. I think. So I think we've had a similar problem that's existed for a long time in the human resources industry as well.
Yes.
So when people come to make complaints about bullying or harassment or misconduct, most organisations seem equally ill-equipped to deal with those conversations as well. And when we did when the inquiry into the suicide rates in FIFO work was done, one of the important reports in that was a Lifeline report, in my view. And that Lifeline report actually identified that one of the significant contributors to mental health concerns in the mining industry was the way that health and safety was managed in that industry.
Yes.
So I think we've known for a long time, and I don't think I don't think anybody, either in the industry or out of it really, who thinks about it for very long is particularly surprised that we're not well equipped to manage this stuff.
Mm.
And I just think, I think the regulators really have gotten it wrong in the legal framework that we've got to this. And part of the problem with the legal framework, I mean, you might say, yeah, WHS has got these regulations, but we now have the Australian Human Rights Commission with new proactive powers to investigate. So almost a quasi-WorkSafe in that area. So we've got two of those. We've got the Fair Work Commission with its anti-bullying and now anti-sexual harassment jurisdictions. We've still got the police sitting out there with their criminal inquiry jurisdictions.
Yeah.
So we've got multiple overlapping legal processes all loosely scattered around this thing we now sort of talk about, a psychosocial risk, which I think creates additional problems as well. You've just got this multiplicity of approaches and regulators all dealing fundamentally with the same issue, I think.
Yes.
And then you lay the whole workers' comp scheme on top of that, Robin. You know, you'd be aware in an Australian context how harmful the workers' compensation process can actually be to people.
Yes, yes. And insurance companies.
Yep.
And then you end up with a whole hierarchy of who has the greatest power in the moment for the client and what's in the best interests of the clients, with competing forces. So people under the Work Health Safety Act, people under the people under human rights, people under Sex Discrimination Act. And so, you know, you throw one more mix in, but the person who's coming into that mix has no training, no expertise, and no experience in what they're doing. At least in some of these other areas, you might think that, at least you would think a case manager for an insurance company, or you would think a case manager in some other area might have some expertise in, you know, the fundamentals of psychology. But in the risk and safety industry, it's never shown an interest in any of that, and it still doesn't. So what can it do? It jumps in now boots first, and I think it actually hurts people. It contributes to further damaging of the client, of either the victim or the person who is being engaged as a witness or someone who's been affected by an event.
I just wanted to jump in here
Yeah.
and just say something. I'm just listening to two of you.
Yeah.
I think I feel such a disconnect between what you are discussing and what's happening in my world, the maritime world, for example, is that we haven't progressed the topic of safety beyond physical safety for a very, very long time. And we struggle with the idea. So what we end up is in a very interesting situation. We have the privatization of regulation. All the regulation is privatized. So we have flag states, so flags of convenience, where you can flag your ship and escape all the liabilities, tax liabilities, and so on. And then you have classification societies that privatize regulation and see regulation as a mechanism to enhance or increase their revenues. And so there is overregulation in many ways. And then you have the assurances that are run by oil majors and so on. And so invariably you end up in a space where you have massive amount of assurances, inspections, investigations, and so on. And because of the nature of the industry, we have temporary labor, most of it, throughout. So you end up in a very interesting situation where everything that is reported as unsafe, whether it's a condition or an act or a behavior, is actually it's actually traumatizing people. It's actually making them distressed and traumatized and so on. So I just find the conversation that you're doing is one step ahead. We have a much bigger problem in the maritime world, that investigations and audits We've had so many suicides, actually. We have so many people jumping overboard because they just couldn't take the bullying from the company to say, we don't want any more non-conformances, we don't want any more problems during audits and inspections. And people are being bullied on ships. And we have a very interesting situation in this world.
Well, I don't know a single auditor or an engineer anywhere in the world who has any qualifications in pastoral care.
Yeah, so if you look at what's happening today, and I wrote down a few points, we have suicides, we have people losing jobs. So the moment you, and this is something maybe it's not so such a pronounced problem in Australia, I believe, because of these strong labor regimes. But we have a problem that every time you have a non-conformity or you have a defect or you have an issue during an inspection or an audit, people are losing their jobs because of that. You're not allowed back in the company if you didn't perform well during a safety inspection. It's a very recognizable problem in this industry. So it creates all sort of problems. And back to the topic of, I think we are actually doing more harm than any good in this industry, at least, in the name of safety practices.
Yep.
So again, Nippin, I would equate that very much. That's quite consistent with what I think the Lifeline report talked about when it talked about mental stress in the mining industry, and it was the rigid application of rules to people.
Yep.
Now, I agree with you up to a point. I think the employment laws that protect people's positions in Australia probably do kick in to an extent. But I think it's true that one of the areas where employers will get support from an employment tribunal is a safety breach. So if workers are involved in safety breaches, that's a valid reason for termination, and it's often upheld by the commissions. And indeed, part of the problem with the current, and the legislation doesn't address this, but the historical formulation of the reasonably practicable test talks about implementation and enforcement of process. And enforcement of process is often evidenced by, here's the disciplinary action we take, here's the people we've terminated. And that's actually beneficial for an employer who's being prosecuted for a workplace accident, sometimes as a defence, sometimes, but very often as mitigation, to say, we take this seriously, this is what we do. So in some ways, it's kind of inherent in judicial systems to be wanting to be able to demonstrate some of those behaviours. And so there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off in there. There is a and even in Australia, we talk about so there's a recognised position that there's in the Australian position as it currently stands, based on recent decision, is that sort of grief and trauma caused by an unfair termination is not compensable. Yep. So there's always trade-offs in all of this stuff. The workers' compensation system in Australia has an express exclusion for compensation for mental health concerns based on reasonable management action.
Yep.
So there's lots of trade-offs here, trying to walk some kind of middle ground around the management of psychosocial harm on the one hand, and the freedom of organisations to run their business on the other. And none of it's in very nice or neat sync.
Greg, I don't know if you've read the book recently published by Rosa Carrillo. Yeah. She interviewed, I don't know, I think she interviewed 40 or 50 work health safety people, and basically asked them about their own psychosocial space with regard to the industry. and she uncovered a great deal of dissatisfaction and alienation of quite a number of risk and safety people saying they really didn't want to go on anymore in the industry. They felt alienated by the industry. They'd lost meaning and purpose in what they were doing. And I mean, I think it's very, very significant research because it shows me that that all of the things that are developing in the risk and safety industry towards a crescendo. So, for example, we continue to poorly educate risk and safety people. We throw them in this deep end, in this psychosocial stuff for which they have no expertise.
And
And you know, we've got the regulator again with no expertise in what they're doing either. And I think it will eventually reach a head. I don't know what will happen, but Rosa's work demonstrates clearly that it's not going away. It's actually amplifying. It's actually getting worse. It's not getting better. And either they will not be able to keep risk and safety people, they won't be able to recruit them, or if they do, they'll fall away quickly, or there'll be some sort of recorrection where risk and safety people step out and say, we can't do any of this. You need to subcontract it. You need to buy in a psychologist or buy in an expert to deal with psychosocial hazards or harm or whatever they're calling it, or an organisational psychologist, but we can't do it. And
I don't disagree, but then there's different, entirely unaddressed level in that most businesses in Australia don't have any health and safety people. Even larger businesses that employ a couple of hundred people often won't have a dedicated.
Yeah, that's kind of, I think for an organisation with over a certain 100 people or something, they have to have that kind of. Well, they often get the HR person to do a 4-day safety course, and then
there's health and safety representatives, but their job is really quite a bureaucratic. It's in the, and it gets abused, but it's in the legislation. Their job is really just to represent the worker.
Yes.
They're like a shop steward. They don't have expertise.
Yeah.
They're not expected to. In some organisations, interestingly, public sector more than others, they do get abused because they, in the sense that they end up being quasi health and safety people.
Yeah, just listening to the two of you, I have a question actually. So what you're saying is that an organization lacks the competence to recognize this problem. Is that what you're saying? The health and the.
I'm not sure that. I think the problem's a bit different in Australia because we have specific regulations and we have specific codes of practice. So in that sense, the regulator has kind of defined the problem. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, and that it's got its problems, and for some organisations it might be helpful. But having known there's a problem, having recognised there's a problem, having the regulator set out what they mean when they talk about psychosocial risk and the sorts of things you have to look for, it's one thing to have that explained to you. It's another thing entirely to then go out and engage with the organisation to come up with some sort of meaningful solution. And we've seen, over the last 30 odd years, we've seen the different variations and the problems it creates. So we come up with this idea of management conversations for safety. And we send out people who have no idea how to have a proper conversation and don't know anything about safety. That creates a whole lot of problems. So then to simply say, here's a code of practice on psychosocial risk and here's your regulations. Now you, who might have been a former crane driver who went and educated themselves through a Cert 4 because they didn't want to be a crane driver forever and ended up as a safety advisor, now suddenly finds themselves as the custodian of these regulations and codes.
Yes.
And they're no better equipped than anybody else to actually go and it's not. I'm very careful here. I'm not being critical of most health and safety people who are very uncomfortable having to take this on. But gee, as a matter of regulation, Rob, it came on very quickly in Australia.
Oh, ridiculous.
And with nothing to support it.
Yes.
In my view.
No, there's nothing to support it. There's still nothing to support it. What concerns me is that there's all this obligation, there's all this pressure, and yet no level of competence to respond to it properly. You know, I have very significant background in things like pastoral care, psychology, organisational psychology, etc. And I look at most of this stuff being thrown out, and I would balk at it. I would be very reticent. I mean, let alone, you know, like I've spent quite a few years of my life working with people in crisis, you know, coming into a family home or coming into a situation where people are in enormous distress and trauma through witnessing or participating in a very uncomfortable event, not even in resulting in death, but incredibly difficult situations. And even then, I feel uncomfortable and reticent about applying my skills and knowledge to that event. Then I step back and look at safety people who have absolutely no experience or knowledge in that, and yet they're asked to go in, and this is where they cause damage. They actually shouldn't. They should say, I'm not capable of this. I'm not trained in this. I have no expertise in this. You should either purchase or contract out to a provider and step away from it. You know, what worries me is stepping.
There's another complexity on that as well, in that most people in health, and again, I'm not being critical of them, but most organisations and people in the health who work in health and safety, apart from some areas, they're not even informed purchasers of psychosocial health support. So, you know, that they wouldn't know if they're getting somebody good to help them.
Yes, yes.
They don't even have that. I like my wife, Vanessa, she's used to be a nurse, and whenever we're dealing with any medical issues across the family, she's a very sophisticated customer of health services. She knows her way around the health system. She knows what's good in a way that I have no idea of. And I think we have that problem in the health and safety in this psychosocial space. I have one or two people that I trust. Not that I trust them to be the people to go into the organisation and fix the problem, but I trust them as informed consumers of this type of service to give an honest answer about what they think people need. Because I can't give that information.
No,
I can tell you what you need to demonstrate structurally from a legal risk management perspective.
Yep.
Right, but that's a very different conversation from actually addressing the problem.
Well, and there's also a problem of size. I find the very large organisations that engage in employee assistance program, they often do engage highly competent organisations with registered psychologists and registered counsellors. And even to be a registered counsellor, you really need to do some fairly sophisticated training. But, you know, if you were in Woolworths or Coles or BHP Billiton or any of these large organisations, you know, they already have purchased those services. They offer them for free. But they're organisations with 20, 30,000 or 100,000 employees, you know, and they've engaged and they pay a considerable amount of money for that. But if you're an organisation with 100 to 200 people and you actually don't even have a risk and safety advisor, you know, and yet all of a sudden you find yourself in a sexual harassment case, or you find yourself in a bullying situation, or you find yourself in, you know, some kind of inequity where a safety person has insisted on shutting down the job or something like that. You know, you can end up in very, very messy, damaging situations where more harm is created than good.
Yeah, but Rob, coming back to what you always say, I think perhaps there is something here about the collective belief of an industry that does not even realize that this is an issue.
No,
I think
a bit
there
of
is
what
something
I
to be
think they
talked
call it
about
the Dun
here.
and Krueger effect, don't they?
Yeah, maybe just talk about that. I think we are looking at risk and safety as a department or a very selective group of people, but I think they operate within
Yeah.
an ecosystem, right? So how do you convince somebody that it is a problem when they don't see it as a problem? We I mean, that's something to talk about, I think.
Um,
Yeah. Well, I worry about the risk and safety industry that cultivates this strange culture that the moment you become a safety officer, you know everything. It seems like we cultivate these people to a position of arrogance. They even think they're kind of quasi lawyers and this kind of stuff. Even I've met people who are regulators, they work for WorkCover or WorkSafe, and they're extraordinarily arrogant about what they think they know about the regulation, but they have no qualifications in law. One
So
of the
here's a
first
question.
things I do is if I have a doubt at all, Nippin, first of all, you have to know you have a doubt. And if I have a doubt, I ring Greg or I email Greg and I start with, I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand. I don't work in courts. I don't understand the court. Can you please give me some advice as a trusted colleague and friend? But the trouble is in the work health safety industry, I think, they don't even have the competence to do that. I think they think once they've got this safety degree or this safety diploma, there's this kind of bluff. I'd call it bluff. That somehow that I have this diploma, the CEO comes to me and says, "Well, you're the safety person. What's your understanding of this?" And goddamn, they sprout what they know about the Work Health Safety Act. Am I
Yeah.
right, Greg?
I think, like all things, Rob, there's greater or lesser degrees, and I think most employers, unfortunately, put your health and safety people in that position.
Yes, they
So
do.
if the CEO comes to me as a health and safety person and says, "What do I need to know?" and if you say, "Well, I don't know,"
Oh, they
better
can't
put
say that.
it. So there's a struggle in that as well. I think
Yes, there is.
it is.
Well,
Nippin,
but
to your
sorry.
point.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this question to you actually. Yeah, please go on. I think, yeah.
No, ask the question. Sorry.
Yeah, so my question to you was that as you go from one organization to another and engage with people at the leadership level, do you see that they have an understanding of psychosocial risks? Do you see that they have yeah, how do they understand this whole issue?
No, no, I don't think. Um, I don't think they have an look. I don't think I have a good understanding of it as a technical issue. I know it's now a structural issue that has to be addressed, but in terms of like how to have a psychologically safe conversation, the sort of thing that Rob was talking about before. Again, I think we're starting to see more of it come into the legal profession, but it certainly wasn't anything I was ever trained in
Yeah.
early on. You take witness statements, and
Right.
it's not your job. Your job's not to be there, although we're trying to get better at that. So I think that the health and people who work in health and safety are not the only people struggling with what this means. I think there's a very limited subset of people,
Yeah.
and the language is getting more and more confusing out there for people.
Yes.
And to your earlier point, Nippin, I think one of the things that is problematic in all of this is that it's dominated by process. So if you think about human resources, because I think that's where most people have historically thought about what we now talk about as psychosocial risk residing in human resources. If I come and talk to you, if I've got a concern, I come and talk to you and I have a conversation about a concern I've got in the workplace, we can have those discussions and we can have all of these concerns until I turn it into a complaint. And once it's a complaint, it's in the grievance procedure.
Yep.
And once it's in the grievance procedure, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser.
Yep.
And all considerations for personal well-being, this is my experience of it historically, is kind of out the window. We have to go through the process. Part of the problem of bringing this overtly into the work health and safety is anybody who raises an issue about a psychosocial risk triggers the process. Because now it's come to me, it's a WHS issue, I have to respond, so it becomes process. And once we take away that space for discussion and restorative justice and the ability to mediate between parties and to resolve disputes, that's when I think harm is more likely to occur than not.
Yep.
And that's, I think, where we find ourselves. There will always be a winner and a loser.
Yes.
Once this comes up. And you can understand it. So somebody, even if somebody witnesses something that they think is bullying or harassment, even they don't have any context, and they raise that as a concern, it triggers a process. So, and then you've got two people potentially who are now straight away very defensive because they've been accused of something, and a third person who may have genuinely raised a concern, who's probably going to be subject to some sort of stress in the workplace because they've raised a concern. And you can't have this anonymous system. Right? You're investigating me. This has got serious consequences for me. Natural justice says I get to know who's made this complaint.
Yeah. You then call the union.
Or your lawyer or whoever, yeah.
That's right. You call a fourth party.
Yep.
So now you've got four.
Yep.
None of whom have expertise in pastoral care.
No. And then WorkSafe might come in because they've got to do an investigation. Human Rights Commission might come in exercising their positive duties. It's I get it. I kind of understand how we've gotten here. We had so much publicity about inappropriate sexual misconduct in Parliament on mine sites, and it won't be limited to those two industries, all right? So we know there's a broader problem out there. And particularly in the case of mining, I think there was a genuinely held public perception through the reports that one of the biggest problems here was that the mining companies had too much discretion in the way that they dealt with these things. So they could sweep it under the rug and they could pay some money and they'd shuffle people around. So instead of saying, well, is there a middle ground that might help us manage this better, we've gone too far the other way and said, no, if these complaints come up, you have no discretion, you have to investigate them like a work health and safety matter. And that's, I think, going to push some of this reporting further down rather than bring it out. We're not, I'll pinch your language, Rob, we're not going to surface any of the issues here.
No, we won't. I actually think the opposite happens.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Great. I think, shall we summarize this discussion? We're already 40 minutes into it.
What did you hear, Nippin? Because I don't know what happens in the UK, because Greg and I are talking about Australia, but I kind of step back now. I just see it as just incredibly. It's worse than it was, than if they did nothing about it, I think. I would have left it up to HR and these other organisations. I wouldn't have got safety involved in it at all. Safety could just keep to what it does, keep to, policing the regulation and physical hazards, and just keep out of this entirely. I think they would have been better off with that. But now they've been drawn into it, I just think it's just made it worse.
But Rob, I think even when it was in the hands of HR and presumably people with HR qualifications, I didn't see any difference in the way they would handle psychosocial risks as
Oh, I
against a
agree.
safety
I
department would.
agree. But now you've got two.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, I appreciate that. I think the problem still remains the same. One of the things, I mean, I keep coming back to the same thing that I think that broader realization that what we are doing in the name of safety is actually harming people is not there yet. We don't see it as a problem. I think a lot of organizations don't see it as a problem. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is when Schettino was being the captain of the Costa Concordia, he was called for an interview after spending all night doing the rescue operation. Yeah, and was called to the court in the morning for an investigation and given 15 minutes to take a shower and two paracetamols when he complained of headache. That is the nature of the problem. We don't see it as a problem at all.
Yeah.
We don't see that that this person could have been traumatized as a result of what he has been through. That realization
Yeah.
does not exist. And I think
No, that's right.
until we get that realization right, it's very, very difficult to do anything in this space, let alone any standards or checklists.
Well, there's no investigations procedure on the market in risk and
No.
safety that acknowledges that position.
And the
You know,
second
the
thing
most
is that,
popular product is called ICAM, and Nippin. The ICAM teaches everybody. You just go into the investigation. There's an objective observer. You collect your evidence. You prepare a report.
yeah,
That's what they propose.
yes. I mean, I was just building on that the captain Francisco Schettino's case, and even if you take it to an average operation at sea, whereby an auditor goes on board a ship, and I always used to do that. Whenever I would go to the ship, I would check the hospital records, and I would find instances where a lot of people are consuming a lot of paracetamol, a lot of paracetamol. Um, so, for example, you see the medical records and you see heaps and heaps of paracetamol being consumed. But even there, nobody asked the question, why are people doing that? That realization does not exist. The only thing you would say is we should control the supply of paracetamol. Nobody dares ask the question, what is it that is triggering this consumption? So I think that realization does not exist, that people can be stressed as a result of what they're going through in their work, in their lives, as a result of the investigations, audits that we are doing. A lot of it is about very control oriented and controlling things that we can conveniently measure. I think that is and psychosocial risk is something you need a lot of expertise to be able to understand it. I don't think it's just risk and safety. I've seen very intelligent people working in education sector at very, very, very senior roles don't have any understanding of psychosocial risks. They just cannot realize it. They cannot see it.
But to your point, Nick, I think the capacity to, and it probably can be balanced, but I think the capacity to genuinely care for people in these sorts of circumstances where a problem has arisen is, in my experience, typically overridden by the requirement to comply with deadlines and processes. So a complaint's being made, corporate procedure says there's a process, I've got X number of days to report it, I've got X number of days for a workers' compensation claim to go in. There's all these mechanics that sit around the outside of people, and they've got to be complied with. And if I start to say, well, you've had an upsetting experience, so I'm going to delay the process to give you a chance to recover.
That's right.
When do I get my process completed?
That's right.
And then if I'm doing that for everybody, all of a sudden I've lost control and I can no longer manage this thing I have to manage. And this is the problem with people have to manage this stuff.
Yep.
The most compassionate person in the world is going to end up inadvertently creating stress for people simply because of the constraints that we put them under to try and deliver against all of these sorts of things.
Except it's funny, Greg, in other professions, caring professions, because I don't think safety is a caring profession, in the clergy where I've worked, and social work where I've worked, and community services and youth services where I've worked, there is no limit on the time. They are all trained for as long as this takes. And so if I came into a situation where a 16-year-old has suicided and I've walked into a family with 3 other children and mum and dad and they don't know what to do because their son jumped in front of a train, as a trained professional, I am there for as long as this takes. And I don't mean days. I mean this process could take weeks and weeks. And then this is the pressure on a social worker. They then have to produce a report, but when it is due according to them. And most people don't understand this, that in the caring professions, counselling, psychology, social work, youth work, community work, the clergy, that's how they work.
Yeah, but
They do not work on deadlines.
but if you're a health and safety investigator under the legislation, you've got 2 years to commence a prosecution.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you've got, these are the constraints.
So we've got at cross purposes.
Absolutely, yeah.
The care for the client, and then a regulation which says, well, that's secondary to a desired outcome, which is produce a report.
And that's what I was trying to get at before. I think once you tip any of these concerns into a process,
yes,
the process takes over. We're no longer concerned with the individuals.
Yes,
and that's fascinating.
In the professions I was mentioning, it's the opposite.
Yeah,
it doesn't work that way.
And that makes a lot of sense because, Rob, you and I often talk about this thing. Organizations, use the metaphor of processes, systems, and so on. So it's some things which cannot be proceduralized do not exist. You can go and traumatize a person, but that does not matter because that does not count within the processes and systems and how they are measured. The success of the processes and systems are measured through different kind of goals, and compassion and empathy and having a good conversation and building relationship does not really fall into that space. Although if you start from there, it's a lot more fruitful and efficient, but it does not really lie within the remit of the organization.
Well, and Nippin, if I was in an organization and I went to the CEO and I said to him, in my professional opinion, it is unreasonable and unprofessional to pursue this until this person is ready, what would the CEO do to me?
I think, particularly my experience in fatality events, there's a willingness to give people some time before we talk to them. Yep. And what we're seeing, well, I'll be honest, what we're seeing more and more is people are producing stress-related medical reports. So you actually, we've got several matters where you never end up talking to people that you ordinarily would need to talk to.
Well, you're ordered not to.
Yeah, but the regulator still exercises their powers to talk to people as much as they can.
Yeah.
So,
but if a doctor issues an order based upon a psychiatric assessment that this person cannot be contacted, then you can't touch them.
Yeah, it's problematic.
Yep.
It's problematic. And and I think, but to your point before, Nippin, when you're talking about empathy and compassion, what we're just seeing now, I think, when we're trying to solve this issue, you don't solve this problem, we're trying to tackle this problem of psychosocial risk, is probably just a macro expression of what we often see. If I come back to management conversations, you can go and have a good management conversation with empathy and compassion, or you can have a mechanistic one because you've got to have a conversation that probably does more harm than good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
This is kind of a macro expression of a problem that we've always known about.
Yeah,
No, but this is a
yeah,
very important point because somebody said to me a few months ago from one shipping company that, we have such pressure and sometimes we have no choice, but we have to make people redundant. We have to make hundreds of people redundant within an hour. We have to make those brutal decisions. And my answer to that
yeah,
was yes, you can make people redundant within an hour, but there is a ways of doing it. You can do it in a very human way, or you could do it in a very, very inhuman way, and makes a difference. It makes a huge difference.
yeah,
I think that is,
Yeah.
and Rob, we often talk about it. It's your first response that matters. But what is your disposition? What is your ethic?
yeah.
And I think
How are
that is
you?
some,
You're
yeah,
you're either disposed towards the person, or you're disposed towards the organisation, or you're disposed towards the regulation, or you're somewhere in between.
Yeah.
great. Shall
Yeah.
we summarize it then?
That that
It's almost an hour.
that's a
Maybe
good
it's
discussion,
good
Nick, and
enough.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
probably a
Yeah.
good time to finish.
So I'll just stop this. Greg, is there anything you wanted to add before I go?
No, thanks, Nippin. No.
Okay.